So I will just thank you for, first of all, for taking your time on a Friday morning. Thank you for attending the call. So I think what we will be discussing next 30 minutes or so is about how can you guys introduce DevOps to your organization. So till the time setup is done, let me just quickly talk about what exactly do we mean by DevOps, right? So I am a product manager at Microsoft. And so this is Pulkit Agarwal. My alias is pulkit.agarwal@microsoft.com. Feel free to reach out to me in case you have any questions. In case the LinkedIn profile is not very visible, you can search for me as Pulkit Agarwal, Microsoft. You should be able to find that. So because we are spending next half an hour, obviously, as a part of DevOps, and I think this is the first talk in, as you mentioned, for DevOps track, I thought let's start with introducing what is DevOps, just to make sure that we're on the same page, right, on this, right? So DevOps is nothing but an amalgamation or union of product, process, and people. But what do we mean by that? What do we mean by the union? It means that people are using the product to implement a process. And the goal of that implementation is that they want to have a value delivery to the customer as soon as possible. So that's what we mean by DevOps when you're talking about DevOps, right? Let's keep that in mind. The biggest point over here is that we want to have a continuous delivery of value to the customers, and we want to do it as fast as possible. So with that background, let's try to jump into what am I doing right now. So I'm a part of Azure DevOps team. What is Azure DevOps? Azure DevOps is a suite of products which basically gives you a life cycle view of all the applications that you have to, you as a developer would have to write. For example, we have Azure boards which will help you do your work item tracking. We have pipelines which is for CI/CD, repos for your Git repository, Azure test plans for manual testing and exploratory testing, and Azure Artifact. So I think I, as a product manager, have been spending last 1.5 years at Microsoft in Azure DevOps, and my day in and day out job is right now to talk to people, talk to companies, understanding their DevOps practices, making them leverage what DevOps practices that we use at Microsoft. And I'll be sharing some of those insights over here today. So Microsoft went on DevOps journey possibly a few years back. And this is one of the reports and current status of DevOps in the industry right now. So this is basically the latest report of 2018. So these are 4 key metrics in which we actually measure progress of how we are tracking and what are the changes that we are bringing with the help of DevOps. So for example, the report says at least that if you just look at these metrics, right, these metrics are huge. They sometimes can be mind-boggling. But we have observed that ourselves at Microsoft, that if you implement DevOps, this is what you will going to get. So as a part of you increasing your deployment frequency, you lowering your change failure rate, you basically moving the code faster to the deployment, to the environment, to the production environment, as well as when there is something that is going down, you'll be able to recover it faster. So DevOps allows you to do all these things. And by virtue of that, what you achieve is obviously a faster time to market, which essentially cycles into a loop where you will be able to have an increased revenue. So end goal of is that ultimately with DevOps, you will be able to have a faster delivery to the customer, so your customers are happy, and hence you will be having more revenue. So let's see that what Microsoft was able to do when we started on this DevOps journey. So I want to take a pause over here a little bit. We are saying DevOps journey, right? So we have been on this journey for some years now. And when I'm saying journey, it's a continuous journey. So you cannot start saying that, hey, we'll implement DevOps in 1 year and be done with that. It's a continuous journey. So at this state where we are right now, this is what we are doing. So this Azure DevOps, the tool that I was talking about, is the one that is being used today at Microsoft for building Microsoft applications. So for example, you talk about Office, Skype, Dynamics CRM, you talk about Bing. All of these products are being built using Azure DevOps. Azure DevOps itself uses Azure DevOps to release itself. So at this point of time at Microsoft, we are doing 78,000 deployments per day. So there was a time, I think some of us which are old enough, you will realize that there were times when we used to ship our product once in 2 years. And by virtue of that, what used to happen was that, for example, you release a product on 31st of December 2018. A customer would say that, hey, I need some more features on 5th of January. You say, okay, boss, wait for 2 more years. We'll be having a next release in 2 years, and you can wait for that. So that has been the typical communication between the market, and the customers. The world has changed since then. You cannot have the customers wait for 2 years because the competition is not doing that. There are competition who are releasing an update to their product that are there in the market every day. So we actually do 78,000 deployments per day. I want you to look at one more number over here. 500 million tests run per day when you're talking about DevOps at Microsoft. So this is the scale that where we operated. So that the world has moved to a place where we have tools in the system where you will be able to execute at this scale. So I think I want you to leave with that thought that it is important, it is going to give you benefits both from a customer satisfaction point of view as well as from revenue standpoint. So you will be able to leverage a lot if you start implementing DevOps. So till now, let's take a break, right? So we have talked about what is DevOps. We have talked about why DevOps is important and why is Microsoft adopting DevOps. So let's walk through a little bit quickly on what you can do. And I want to basically take a change and what you can do to start implementing DevOps at your end, in your organization. So as a part of that, right, so we discussed two things. So DevOps is a amalgamation of people, that's you guys, a product and a process. So during the course of next 5-10 minutes, we'll be walking through the process. What exactly do we think is the right DevOps process? And then we can basically spend some time on tools which are available in the market right now. So when you say DevOps process, right, it has, we think about this in 4 layers or four stages. The first is the planning stage. What does that mean? So planning stage is something where you as a product manager comes up with a backlog, try to understand, try to read the market, try to understand that what exactly you would have to do to win the market, to win over the customer. So you come up with a plan, you prioritize that plan, you come up with the execution plan, and that's what basically you start sharing with your team. So we at Microsoft follow a sprint model. So you have the agile implementation of that, and obviously if some of these words are basically interesting to you, we can obviously have a more deeper conversation because this is a huge topic that can be covered in 30 minutes. But I want to leave you guys with thoughts and pointers as to what you guys can start looking at after the talk. So in planning, what we do is we follow a 3-sprint model where we have a visibility. When we are doing our planning, we do a plan for 3 sprint where the 3-sprint plan gives engineers and the team over there a vision as to what they will be doing over next 3 sprint. Each sprint in our case is of 3 weeks. So we iron out exactly what you would be doing as a development team for next 3 weeks, and we have a vision as to where we would like to be 3 weeks from now or 3 sprints from now. So I as a product manager has to always be a couple of sprints ahead of my development team to make sure that we have ironed out exactly what we would like to deliver at the end of the sprint. So let's talk a little bit about sprint. What does a sprint mean? So sprint in our case is basically a logical time boundary where we think that we will be able to deliver a logical value to the customer. So which means that at the end of every sprint, we would have delivered something to the customers. So customer would not have to wait for a long period for something to be released. We would have a bigger major release, a major feature that will be released at the end of 3 weeks. The second part of DevOps process basically is development and test. So like you as a product manager has created a backlog which is obviously prioritized and have asked the development team to start and run with that. What does that mean? So when the sprint starts, the team starts developing on the backlog that you have prescribed or we are suggesting. In that development testing process, what we suggest to our developers or the developers do over here is that they implement the functionality, they build and test the functionality in the local system. So we use version control for that. For every check-in that is being done in version control, there is a build that is triggered. And for every build that is triggered, there is a test that happens. So we, for example, I can give you an example of Azure DevOps, right? So we run, the last time I checked, we run about 70,000 tests per check-in. Per check-in, we run 70,000 tests at that moment. So so that's basically, and that is happening on every check-in. So that's the second part of it. So once you have done with this part, what you have is that you have a deployable code which you can deploy and start sharing with the customers. So now comes the third part of it, which is release part. Now you have a package which can be released to the customers. So at the end of 3 weeks or end of the first sprint, you have a package. What you can do is you have to have a continuously deployable automation pipeline up and running. So what we do over there is that we have a continuous deployment pipeline running, and obviously we'll walk through that in how do we do that. But for you, the takeaway over here is that in that deployment pipeline, you need to make sure that you have automated tests that are running, functional tests are running, integration tests are running, and then you release on environment by environment basis. So what we do is there are two things that we take care of at this layer. So we release on multiple environments, stage by stage, and each stage that we call has a tier of customers. So for example, the stage 0 or the first stage or staging environment that we has friends of Microsoft. The stage 1 has distant friends of Microsoft, and obviously then the customer. So we roll it out in phase manner. By virtue of that, what happens is that because you are deploying and testing automatically as well as manually, the customers are testing for you, you will be rolling out the functionality in piece by piece, and hence you will be able to recover in case there is any failure. So over here, if you notice that in the build process as well in the release process, what we have done is that we have integrated testing in our experience very tightly. And you need to make sure that you test out the code that you are building, the code that you are deploying on a very frequent basis, so that you are making sure that when the code is reaching to the customers, it is in a proper shape. So this is the third part. So now the code has reached to our customers. What is we started with the Devops process saying that, hey, we want to deliver value to the customers. And some people say that, hey, because we have already released the product has been reached to the customer, that DevOps cycle should end. No, actually it's not. Where it ends is that you as a team need to make sure that what you thought in your planning as hypothesis, that yes, we will be delivering this value, is customer actually getting that value or not? So this is where your DevOps cycle ends. For example, you think that, hey, when I do ABC feature, my customer will be able to achieve X. Unless and until you are able to measure that your customer value is delivered, your customer life is improved, till that point you cannot claim that your functionality that you started off with in the planning stage is actually delivered to the customer. So the point over here is not of delivering the package. The point over here is that we want to deliver value to the customer, and for you to make sure that the value has been delivered to the customer, you need to have metrics that are being implemented, which are tracking that yes, this value has been implemented, has been transmitted to the customer. A couple of ways in which we do is basically testing production. Testing in production is basically A/B testing. That you can test out that, okay, for a customer set which has not been exposed to your new version, are they basically facing the same problems that they were facing earlier versus the customer which have been exposed, the 10% of customers which have been exposed to the new version, have their life increased? And you can match and balance those two metrics together and see if there is a difference that you are seeing in the behavior, in the experience of those customers. And you need to define those metrics. The metrics that I'm talking about here are not defined post facto. When you are doing your planning, as a part of the planning, it's very important that you define a success criteria of a product. So the planning exercise involves that once I deploy this particular functionality to my customers, this is what I'm expecting, and this is a success criteria. If I am making a change for sign up to be increased on my website because of ABC feature that I have rolled out, and the sign up are not increasing by 10%, that's a feedback for you as a product manager. That's a feedback to your team as a team that, hey, there is a problem and we need to iterate on it again. So we are talking about iteration, and it's important that we focus on delivering value in an iterative manner. And the reason for that is that you need to make sure that you give your bits to your customer as early as possible so that I can iterate faster. And the iteration itself is basically where you require the tool to come into picture. So we have been talking about processes till now, that what exactly do you need to do. The tools where they come into picture is that they help you implement this process in an automated fashion so that you can iterate faster. So let me basically have this clear, and just wanted to now engage with the audience a little bit more. How many of you have right now a tech stack which has one of these? At least one of these. Quite a few, huh? At least two. At least two as well. Okay, at least four. Okay. What are you using, sir?
I'm using GitLab, Jenkins, Ansible, and Tomcat.
Tomcat. Perfect. Okay. So we have a coverage of quite a few people over here that you are using some of these technologies. So what I am going to demo in a while right now is that how can you start having a DevOps workflow tying all these three things, all these 5-6 things together. A quick check also from my side. How many of you are developers over here? Okay. Anybody who is from college? A few from college as well. Okay. Okay. How many of you are business leaders and IT managers? Anybody? Okay. All right. Okay. Just let me see. I'll change to the demo. 1 second. Yeah. Can we switch the screens for the demo, please? Perfect. So what I have over here is basically a GitLab where, so GitLab is nothing but the version control system and implementation of version control system. So in the demo that I am having right now, let's assume there is a company ABC who is using GitLab for version control system. They are using Jira for work item tracking, basically the planning part of it. They are using Jenkins for their build system. So Jenkins is a build system for you, for those of you who do not know. They're using Azure pipelines for deploying and orchestration of their deployment pipeline. And they have two instances running. One is running on EC2, which is Amazon's virtual machine of VM, which is the test environment, let's assume. And the other one is running on Azure, which is the production environment. So this is the, let's assume that this is the tech stack. So let's try to set up a CI/CD process for that. So what I realized that, what is the process, right? So I, as a product manager, realized that, hey, there is a small problem. The name of Cambridge, the spelling is wrong. There's a small bug that I'll file. So I'll start with that. So I'll go to work item. I'll file a bug for that. So for the sake of this demo, I've already filed a bug. Like for example, this KOD-3. This is the bug that I've filed, which is fix the homepage for the app. It's showing the wrong product name. Okay. So this bug is basically added to the backlog, and engineers at the start of the sprint start executing on it. So as soon as they start executing on it, what they do is that they go to the code repository. For the sake of this demo, what I have done is that ideally you should be doing versioning or branching. Because a small chain, for the sake of this demo, what I have done is that I have excluded the branching policy, but we can talk about that later outside the talk as well. So let's say, for example, I change to Cambridge. And I update over here as KOD-3, which was my Jira work item. I commit the change. So as soon as you commit the change over here, it should launch a build in Jenkins. I'm assuming you guys are able to see that at the back, right? So 115 was launched for that. And because I am managing my release pipeline in Azure pipelines, as soon as the build completes, ideally it should trigger a release pipeline as well. So let's see. So this is 114. So it triggered a release pipeline. So what we are doing over here in the release pipeline is that we are deploying this application code to AWS instance. How we are doing that? We have uploaded the application code to a repository, which is Artifactory in this case. We can go in details later on. And then we have deployed this to a Tomcat server, which is running in my EC2 instance. Because I have deployed in my EC2 instance, what will happen is that ideally this should update. Voila. Okay. So this is basically an update has happened on my testing environment. Now I talked about what kind of checks and balances do we want to keep in place. So what we do over here at Microsoft is, or at least we recommend a customer to do is, that once they have released a test environment, they somehow figure it out that, hey, there is a testing that has to happen. So here you see that the next environment, so to say, which was basically my Ansible, which my running on Azure, still does not have the latest changes. So what we have done, the reason why it is not having latest changes is because we have implemented a gate over there. So this integration right now is with ServiceNow, but obviously you can write any integration. So what you will say is that, hey, unless and until I approve this change in my ServiceNow workflow, I would not allow you to deploy this change to production. And this could be anything, right? So which means that, and this could be manual testing as well, this could be test cases as well, which is automated as well. So in case there would have been a test case over here, and the test case would have failed, the deployment would have failed. So for the sake of this demo, I'll ignore this gate for now, saying that, hey, I know that, hey, this is the right change, I have done that, so let's ignore it. And this will basically do the next sampling. What it does is next sampling in 4 minutes. So till the time this is done, the deployment is happening. This deployment is happening using Ansible. So let's basically just double click on how the deployment is happening, and then we can come back to that in a couple of minutes. So what we do over here is, in Azure pipelines, we will be able to deploy the app using Ansible. So what Azure pipeline, so I think the tool that you should be looking at is basically that you should be able to have those integration points with different tool providers that you're already using. So Ansible will basically help you deploy to Azure. So let's give it a second, and then we'll come back to that one. So now I think this part of it is talking about that, hey, how can you deploy using a tool, which is a current existing setup. And I think one of the questions I really wanted to focus on in this conversation is that if you were to implement these changes at your end, in your system, how would you go about it, right? So I just wanted to have, can you guys switch back to the PPT? Right. So I just demoed, and we'll come back to the deployment of the production environment in a second. But I wanted to take one more example of if you were to do that in your organization, how would you do that, right? So I'll basically ask another question. How many of you guys work with at least one of these? Okay. At least 2? All 3? Okay. What about this? How many of you guys have this in the part of the stack? What about this? Where's code repository? Okay, perfect. So let me basically walk you through a demo where we would be setting up a CI/CD pipeline with these constructs. The code is there in GitHub, which is a Node.js code, and we will be deploying it to Kubernetes cluster using Docker, obviously the container image, and the Helm chart. So we have an option of creating, so there are 2 options that you have right now. So first option that you have is that you can create a sample application to run your CI/CD process, or what you can do is you can start bringing in your own code. So what I have is right now I have my own code for which I want to set up my CI/CD process. For that, what I'll do is I select my GitHub repository. So the GitHub repository that I have is already tied up with my account. So this Node.js is a repository that I have created over here, which has a Node.js application, which has a Docker file attached to it, and it has Helm charts. So for those so basically Docker file is for the container, and Helm charts for your Kubernetes deployment. So we'll be using that. So in this one, what we do is we have the repository, we have the branch which is master. This is the master branch, and we will be saying that, hey, okay, the next step will be that, okay, what you want to specify, there's a Docker file or not. Yes, a Docker file. And you can choose that where do you want to deploy it. So my Docker file location is Okay, this is perfectly fine. And I need to have a location for my Helm charts as well. So the two inputs that you need to provide over here is part2 Docker file and part2 charts. Are you guys able to see that screen at the back? All right. So for those who raised your hands in setting up a Kubernetes cluster, can you help me understand that roughly how much time and how many clicks and how many fields that you have to enter set up a Kubernetes cluster today? API. Like how much time does it take?
In a single call we can raise it.
Perfect. Okay. So what we have done is that we have given you a quick start way where you can just provide us a Helm chart location. I am going to use my account. Let's say, for example, I call it OSI India demo. I do have not, and be done with that. So in these three steps, what we have done over here is that we have created a CI/CD pipeline using the GitHub repository that I pointed out to, and a CI/CD pipeline is up and running on the new Kubernetes cluster that you have spawned. If you have your own Kubernetes cluster, we will be able to develop a CI/CD pipeline for that as well. So this setting of it, because we are creating a new cluster, it takes some time. So what I have done is that I have, for the sake of this demo, what I have done is that I have pre-created one endpoint, which is basically using the same workflow. For example, I have my code repository. Let's see if the font size is visible. So I have my code in GitHub, which the same code base that we talked about. It creates a CI/CD pipeline, which is using basically my Docker container and my Helm charts, and I am deploying to a Kubernetes cluster. So at the end of it, what you will have is you will have a sample pipeline or a pipeline which is up and running on this Kubernetes endpoint, and you can play around with that. So this is a sample application that we started with GitHub, and we were able to deploy to Kubernetes cluster, right? Okay, I think that's what I wanted to cover. Last thing, because we left this part over here, I'm assuming that the deployment should have ended over here. The deployment says is ended. And once I refreshed my Azure stack, which was deployed via Ansible, this should update ideally. Yes. So by virtue of that, what we have done is that we were able to create a CI/CD pipeline and have checks and balances deployed to multiple stages, as well as if you want to get started, you can get started with Azure Devops project, which will help you create a CI/CD pipeline on all the resources and the languages that you need. For example, over here, we support at this point of time, there are tools in the market which support this point of time, .NET application, Java application, Python, PHP, Ruby, Go. And obviously, if you do not want to have a sample application, you can bring your own code from GitLab or GitHub. Thank you. Yeah, perfect. I think I was running out of time. So what you do over here is that in pipelines, one of the things that value proposition that we have is that you will be able to track what exactly changes have been done. So for example, over here, if you see this environment that we talked about where the deployment happened, you will be able to see that commits that have gone in. So this is the commit, which is basically had come from GitLab. And this is the work item that we created, which was there in Jira. So yes, you have end-to-end traceability as a part of this as well.